let's get this show on the road. Okay, we have white against an 1890. We did play the Jababa London in one game. That's up on YouTube. But now we're back to the official recommendations. E4, E5. So when we were like 14, 1500, we were playing mostly the Vienna. Just to remind you, my two major recommendations for beginner and intermediate players are the Vienna, which goes knight c3, knight f6, and f4, as well as the four knights Scotch, which is knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. That's the four knights. And then the Scotch part consists of the move d4. So I'm basically eeny, meeny, miny, mowing it. Let me think about what I want to play in this particular game. You could play the Vienna. Obviously, the Vienna loses some of its luster at a higher level because people know the theory and most people don't fall for some of the basic traps that can give white a winning position. So let's go for our other big weapon, and let's go for Knight Scotch. Don't remember if we've had a 4-Knight Scotch game in this speedrun. You can probably look that up pretty easily, but that doesn't really matter. So, of course, in this position, black is not obligated to play knight f6, but the other moves contain pretty serious drawbacks. Okay, f5 is a move that I've seen tangentially, but never really analyzed. This is the deferred Latvian Gambit. So the Latvian Gambit, which we actually just talked about for those watching on YouTube, Latvian Gambit came up in one of our discussions. After knight f3, f5 signifies the traditional Latvian Gambit. The insertion of the moves knight c6, knight c3 changes the nature of the position because knight takes c5 is no longer possible. And in response to f5, white's main weapon is knight takes c5. The Latvian Gambit is essentially refuted. Here, the e5 pawn is protected. Now, what is generally the approach when we meet moves like f5? All right, moves like f5 are often considered unsound because they make permanent and tremendous weaknesses on the king side, and generally the best way to exploit that is to open up the center. So I think a lot of people, when seeing this move for the first time, would be tempted to play a move like d3, which is of course very passive. It closes the bishop and it justifies black's setup. After d3, knight f6, black gets a great position. So of course we can accept the gambit with e takes f5, but that affords black a valuable tempo that they can use for development, for example, knight f6. And of course, it also justifies the move f5. You can almost think of it as a reverse king's gambit, where taking this pawn isn't quite as good when the white queen doesn't have a path to h5, and we can't support the pawn with g4 because the knight on f3 blocks the queen's access to these two squares. So what I'm getting at is that there's only one move, which is calling my name in this position, and it should be calling your name as well. And you should be playing it really without all that much calculation because there really isn't that much to calculate. This move does not come with a big risk tag, right? You play d4, we're not sacrificing anything. We are tearing the center apart in order to open up avenues to get to black's king. It might seem like this move is very complicated and you need to think about it, but if you break down what's actually happening in the center, you'll see that it's pretty simple to follow. E takes d4. We just play knight takes d4. Black can take twice on d4, but then our queen comes out, and the queen on d4 is going to be a monster. If black takes the other pawn, f takes e4, that's a little bit trickier. There we have to be careful, because if we recapture on e4, then we allow black to move d5 with tempo, and black can drive a wedge into the center with e4. So in response to f takes c4, we should actually then take the pawn on e5, offering a knight trade. And in the resulting position, not only is black's king in mortal danger, but we also have a big development advantage, and black will just have a hard time keeping the e4 pawn protected. So this is going to be really, really fun. I'm looking forward to this. And it's pretty encouraging that our opponent is taking his time, because that means this isn't some deep gambit preparation. But hopefully you're able to understand the logical underpinnings of the move d4, and you're able to see that this move can be played largely on the basis of intuition. What am I expecting black to do here? I think our opponent is likely to play e takes d4. Is black lost out of the opening here? Actually, the answer to that question might be yes. From a practical perspective, handling the resulting complications when the king is as weak as it is virtually impossible. I think white is probably already borderline winning, barring some sort of computer play. Yeah, not GG just yet. I'm very curious how our opponent responds to this move. It's crazy that 4 moves in, this much could already could already be happening. Right, the move F5 is just so incredibly damaging because it opens up so many new pathways to the Black King. Queen H5 will always come with check. If we bring the bishop out to C4, the king is not going to be able to castle. Those are the 2 main drawbacks of pushing the F-pawn this early in the opening. Okay, so e takes d4. Of course, we play knight takes d4. Note that in response to knight takes knight, we shouldn't give a check on h5. This check is not currently all that dangerous because it can be blocked with g6. And your mental reference should be, okay, if there's a knight, let's say on e5 or h4, then g6 can be met with knight takes g6. And that's a classic trick that hopefully you've seen in puzzle rushes and in different kinds of puzzles, even if you're a beginner. Here, queen h5 is not an immediate threat. If it was our move, well, obviously the f5 pawn is currently hanging, but assuming it wasn't, our next move would be bishop c4 and then castles, and hopefully the e-file opens just in time for us to put a rook on e1. The most important factor is going to be preventing black from castling kingside. We have to do whatever it takes to prevent black from castling kingside. Okay, this is a very juicy position. So again, the instinct is to just recapture on e4. But when you're trying to punish a gambit or an unsound opening, you have to think very concretely, and you always have to play for maximum. So just meekly recapturing a pawn without considering the alternatives is the best way to justify the gambit or the unsound line. And there's one trick that I'm spotting here, which I think comes very close to winning this game for white right off the bat. Now, if you know anything about openings that involve an early push of the f-pawn, for example, there's the Damiano, which might be the most famous of these unsound defenses. It's f6 in this position. Who can tell me what the classic refutation is to the move f6? This is a move everybody should know. It's actually not the only way to refute f6, but it's the most famous. You sacrifice the knight on e5, and in response to f takes e5, you deliver a check on h5. Now, didn't I just say that the check isn't dangerous? Well, there's another circumstance under which queen h5 wins the game, and that is, if you can take on e5, not only is that a check, that forks the rook in the corner. Queen picks up the rook, and then the queen easily gets out of the corner because black doesn't have the machinery to attack it with. I'll show this in some depth after the game. What similarity can we extract from the Damiano? Well, the only big similarity is that the f-pawn has moved out of its initial square, allowing us to check on h5. But there's a second similarity, which is that the e5 square is now accessible to the white queen once the f-pawn has moved out of f5. Not immediately, because the knight is guarding that square, but we can trade the knight. So I think knight takes c6 essentially wins the game. As crazy as it may seem to trade pieces when you're trying to punish an unsound opening, this is what I meant when I said you have to think concretely, right? Knight c6 isn't necessarily a logical move, trading a knight in the center for a knight that has just come out, but it's a move based on concrete considerations. Black has to recapture. Then we deliver a check on h5. g6 gets forked. Okay, this doesn't change anything. We still check on h5. In fact, dc, I think, is the only way for black to stay alive for longer than a couple of moves. Yeah, this is what black has to do, king e7. Obviously, our opening strategy has resulted in success, but it's important not to rest on our laurels. Actually winning these types of positions where you have what seems to be a decisive development advantage can be a lot harder and more frustrating than it appears. So don't think that our job is already done and everything wins. That could not be further from the truth. First things first, bishop g5 does not win the queen because black brings the knight out to f6. Okay, so bishop g5 check might be a good move, but we shouldn't hope to win the queen with that move. Now, after knight f6, I see the move knight takes e4, using the pin against the knight and putting more pressure on the knight. So that's one way to play. We, of course, can still give the check on e5. That'll probably force black to play bishop e6, because the moment the king moves to f7, the other bishop comes out with check, and that seems utterly devastating. So let's consider that for a second. Queen e5 check, bishop to e6. The bishop is pinned, So bishop c4 comes to mind in that position, but the queen can come up and protect the bishop, simultaneously offering a queen trade. That is the last thing that we want here, a queen trade, unless it is accompanied by, let's say, material gain of some sort. Okay, so let me think about this for just a couple more seconds. I have a pretty cool idea in mind. I'm just verifying that it's as good as it looks. I really think it is. I think it is. Okay, so here's how I propose that we continue. I still like the move bishop g5 check, for starters. I also like queen e5 check. I think there are multiple ways to reach a decisive advantage. Even the simple knight takes e4. I talked about this a couple of games ago when we had a comparable attack. I think it came from an Alapin, where oftentimes there's a temptation to overcomplicate and start calculating long lines, whereas a very simple move like knight takes e4 keeps all of the advantages of the position. It restores material equality and it gets a knight to the center. So if you're struggling and you're not finding anything, resorting to simple moves such as a recapture or a developing move can be an easy way to maintain the pressure. So I'd like to start either with bishop g5 check or with bishop c4. I don't actually think it matters. Yeah, let's start. Let me think about this. Okay, let's go bishop c4. So we're bringing out the light squared bishop. We're threatening immediate checkmate on f7. And I am hoping for the move queen to e8. This is what I'm expecting. Why am I expecting queen e8? Well, black somehow has to defend the f7 square. We've already established that g6 never works because of queen e5 check, at the very least picking up the rook in the corner. Knight g8 to h6 walks into bishop g5, and black has nothing to block the pin with. The only other move that I see here is bishop c8 to e6, intercepting our bishop, but I didn't take that move too seriously. Maybe I should have. But I figured even if we trade on e6, that brings the black king out even to an even more vulnerable spot. And in that resulting position, again, we can play it simple. We can play knight takes e4, for goodness sake. And then the knight jumps into g5. That has to be devastating. The greatest thing about playing this position is that we're not down material. It's not like we've sacrificed anything to reach this position. And that is why you can allow yourself to play in simpler ways than you would have been able to if you were down a piece right now and you really had something to prove. Here, you can just kind of chill out and play simple moves, and worst comes to worst, okay, your opponent consolidates, you reset, and you continue attacking. Let's take on e6. We're playing this like a Russian schoolboy, trading off one of black's only defenders. Now the king is all alone, but we don't have the machinery to exploit the king position yet. All we have is our queen currently in the attack. We can give, let's say, a check on g4, but that's counterproductive because it sends the king back to safety on f7. The queen is very well placed here because it's blocking off the king's escape back to f7, back to the king's side. Let's play knight takes e4. Why didn't I instead develop the bishop? Because I was worried about knight g8 to f6. And once the queen is knocked off of h5, the king can drop back to f7. And once it reaches f7, black comes very close to consolidating. All black will have to do then is bring their bishop out, move the rook, and kind of manually castle. The king will eventually reach the promised land on g8. So that's what we have to avoid at all costs. And that's why I took on e4. I'm threatening to deliver a check on g5, forcing the king in the other direction, which is what we want. If we can force the king onto the d file, hopefully you're able to see that the rook on h1 is only one tempo away from joining the attack. I mean, we will castle kingside at some point, and then we'll be ready to play rook d1. Queen also defends that square, so we can play rook d1 even if the black king hasn't blocked the queen. So knight g5 is one huge threat. Don't forget that knight f7 could be a simple way to win material, regardless of the king's placement. Of course, black could make a mad dash for the queen side. King d7, castles king c8. But once the king reaches c8, it doesn't, black's problems aren't solved there. And I think we can still get to the king if it's on the queen side. If he goes queen to e8, well, obviously then we avoid the queen trade. I'd have to think about it. Queen e8 is probably black's best move. I think we can deliver a check on g4 in that case. And that contradicts what I just said. It allows the king to move back to f7. We really have no choice in that situation. But the caveat is that after we castle, our knight still is able to jump into g5. So the king on f7 isn't fully safe if we're able to deliver the check on g5. And I'll show some of those lines after the game. Queen d5 is definitely a good move. It's a good defensive move. Now we rule out queen takes d5 check. The obvious move, I think, is knight to g5 check. That forces the king back toward d7 or e7. And in all cases, I think the king doesn't reach safety because there's always these diagonal checks that we can deliver if the king moves to d7. If the king moves to e7, then we'll most certainly castle and put a rook on e1 and continue shepherding the king toward the most dangerous part of the board, which is the d file. I don't see a reason for us to dilly-dally. I think we should give this check promptly. Not over. I mean, our opponent is defending resiliently. And if you play an engine in a position like this, you're going to lose like 99 times out of 100 because actually finishing someone off who's defending super accurately, Hikaru does this too, you can feel like you're mating him 10 different ways, but checkmating the king in an open board when the king is stuck in the center like this is incredibly hard because the king has so many directions that it can escape to, and the center is open, which means that there's a high probability and possibility of trades. So you got to manage all of that load and hunt the king at the same time with limited material. That's hard. So don't feel like the checkmate in these types of king hunts is easy or you're missing something obvious if you don't see something convincing. So we're waiting for our opponent to decide where he wants to put the king. I'm expecting king d7, but the best move is probably king to e7. In both cases, I think we're just going to castle short without too much of a thought. Without a second thought, I should say. We've already put in some thought. Man, this is completely winning, no doubt about it. But a couple more precise moves are required. I think some people watching this thus far might be disappointed that we haven't sacrificed anything. We haven't made any sexy moves. We've just literally played the most simple moves on the board. We made a developing move. We made a capture. We made a capture. And then we delivered like the most obvious check. And this comes back to the point I made in that Alapin game, which ultimately resulted in checkmate, which is that I think when you read books on attacking and tactics, the art of attack in chess might be misrepresented in your mind, and you might reach the false idea that every attack somehow culminates in a combination or must feature some sort of a sacrifice. In fact, 90 to 95% of attacks in chess are attacks of the salt of the earth variety, where you just make a bunch of simple attacking moves and the king is checkmated or you win a decisive amount of material. And it's important to understand that because then you kind of know what you're looking for and you shouldn't shy away from these straightforward moves. Thank you, Chess Dojo, for the raid. Appreciate it. Not trying to, get on the soapbox here, but I think I know quite a few players who tend to rule out certain moves because they're quote unquote too simple or they're not sacrificial enough. There's a time for sacrifice, but that time doesn't occur as frequently as you might think when you're attacking. Can Magnus hold this position? I don't think so. In a classical game, I think this is borderline resignable for black. Somebody was proposing king f6 here. It doesn't fundamentally change the fabric of the position. I still think that we should castle. Why is it so important to castle as king f6 is played? Because rook e8 check is a potential idea. Although, on second thought, that square is protected. So maybe we can use this tempo to do something a little bit smarter. I have a second idea that I just came up with, which is a move I didn't really appreciate at first, but the more I look at it, the more I like it. I will admit that I didn't notice the e8 square was defended until just a second ago. So I think a lot of people are catching my drift here, which is that the bishop would be ideally placed on the long diagonal. And so a lot of people come up with the move b3, but you really have to optimize your ideas in this type of position. Don't just make the first execution of the idea that you see. Try to weigh its minuses and act on those minuses to find a different, better execution. What is the drawback of b3? Well, it's not actually a developing move, and it allows black to deliver a very unpleasant check on b4. Then black can beat white to the punch and stick a bishop on c3, which prevents us from playing bishop b2. So what's the different execution that I'm speaking of? Well, it's the simple bishop to d2. the modest looking bishop to d2. We're aiming for c3. Once the bishop reaches c3, I feel like the king is just busted. We force the king back to the e-file, then we can castle, and then once a rook lands on e1, literally every piece will be joining in the attack. So I don't see any reason for us not to play bishop d2. Notice that queen e5 check might be a scary looking move because it forces white's king to move, but we don't care about that. All we need is one rook. We don't really need both of our rooks in the attack. So after queen e5, king f1, that's not the rook that we expected would be jumping in, but who cares? Rook a1 to e1 is going to be devastating. Queen f7 will be a mate threat in that resulting position. I call this thinking in terms of squares. Anytime you're attacking a wide open king like this, you at all times have to be aware of the potential mating constructions. In this case, I only really see one, which is queen f7. But you make a mental note to yourself that anytime black's queen loses contact with f7, you're going to be aware that queen f7 becomes a serious idea. I don't see any other mating constructions with the black king on f6. Okay, g6. g6. Well, that doesn't change anything. We, of course, still play bishop c3 check, and I think this is going to lead to decisive material loss imminently. Note, by the way, that the discovery knight takes h7 check is possible, but clearly inferior because the king is able to reach g7. Black can also sacrifice the exchange on h7, and the black queen is defended. It's defended by the c6 pawn. So knight takes h7 here is ill-advised, and it certainly does not win the queen. Of course, we play bishop c3 check anyway, forcing the king toward the center. And after the king reaches the center, you should, of course, also notice that the rook on h8 is hanging, which might not seem significant, but it is, right? When you're attacking, you're not just hunting for checkmate, you're also trying to win a decisive amount of material. That is a totally legitimate outcome of an attack. Simplifying and emerging, let's say, up a piece or up a rook in an endgame, that can be a practical and simple way to finish off an attack and convert it into something tangible. Yeah, very good. Queen e2. Queen e2 check is going to finish the game once the king reaches e7, because the king is going to be forced back to the d-file where we will pick it off. Well, rather, we'll pick the queen off with rook to d1. And that is all she wrote. King cannot move to f6, cannot move to f7. Okay, so there are a couple of modifications that we can make here. But again, let's keep it as simple as possible. Of course, you should see that black can play rook e8. But that's what I was talking about. In that position, we can, if we want, keep our queen. We can play rook takes queen and then intercept the e-file with bishop e5. But there is a much simpler way to guarantee victory after rook e8. Much simpler. Who can spot this sequence of moves? The move order actually doesn't really matter, but you want to try to follow the most clinical, the most forcing move order. Yeah, you could even play bishop takes h8 here. That is a way to really rub it in black's face, who the boss is, but much simpler is to first take the queen, then take the rook, and then take the other rook. Or we can immediately play, actually we can immediately play bishop takes h8, rook takes c2, king takes c2, and we are up a full rook. Once you see a continuation like this, that you know for a fact is going to guarantee victory, as it just did, there's really no need for us to search for anything else. There's no need for us to calculate a move like bishop e5. Maybe black has this. This is exactly how you butcher these types of games. You try to get too fancy, and you try to checkmate rather than make the most practical conversion of the attack. That was nice. It was a simple game, but it really illustrates how bad the move f5 is, like, across most openings, with the exception, of course, of the Dutch. But the reason f5 here is justified is because this diagonal is closed and this diagonal is closed, right? White hasn't moved the e-pawn yet, so it really changes the dynamic of the game. Although f5 is a pretty dubious opening, even against one d4. You have to know a lot of very tactical lines, like the Staunton Gambit with e4 is nothing to sneeze at. And this can get very, very, very dicey for black if you don't know all of the theory. So let's have a look at exactly how bad the move f5 here is. So we respond with d4. Hopefully the logic behind this move was clear enough. Really, really quickly, I was referencing the Damiano, which is f6. There is a fascinating story between why the Damiano is called what it is called, right? You might say, well, what kind of an idiot was Damiano to advocate for a move like f6, which even if it's the year is 1400 or 1500, which is when Damiano lived, and opening theory isn't well developed, just using first principles, it's obvious that f6 is a very bad move. You're blocking the knight's normal developing square, you're opening up a diagonal, you're weakening the king side permanently. So it's obviously a bad move. And even d4 leads to an almost decisive advantage for white. But knight takes e5 is the famous refutation. It's been known for hundreds of years, really since the 1500s. And it is followed by queen h5 check, forking the king and the pawn. One fork turns into another. If black plays g6, we win the rook in the corner. It's important to point out that in this position, black cannot play bishop g7 on the next move because of the pin against the bishop. So I think the simplest is to play d3 and essentially to pre-move bishop g5, which pins and potentially wins the knight. Black loses all of his frickin' pieces. Or you can even play bishop to h6 if you want to keep it simple, and then simplify by taking on f8 with the queen and forcing a queen trade. White is up an exchange and a pawn in the resulting endgame. There are many ways to win. You can analyze this with an engine if you want to be very diligent. You can also play knight c3. Okay, so g6 loses, and king e7 loses in even more spectacular fashion because the king is driven to the edge of the earth with a series of checks, and king g6 gets checkmated in a very famous style. This is a very famous line. Again, it's been known for centuries. Check. Now a discovered check with the pawn. And now the classic, right? You can see the rook, you can see the king. They are x-raying each other, so h4 is a very thematic mating move. You're threatening hg and queen f7. It's mate in 9 according to the engine, if black gives up like all of his pieces. So white can play bishop takes g5 or hg. There's nothing left to analyze. Technically, it is more resilient to play d5 with the idea of protecting the f5 square with the bishop. And here white has many ways to win, but there's a very beautiful line that also has been known for many centuries. It starts with h4. So you're threatening to play h5 followed by a discovery with d4, forcing black to make some luft. And now there is a beautiful move that ends the game on the spot. It wins a decisive amount of material. Who knows what this move is? And by the way, the same move would follow after h5. It would come with even greater effect. It's bishop takes b7. Yeah, this is worth knowing. This is worth knowing. It's a deflection sacrifice, but it's not really a sacrifice because this is checkmate. And in the event of h5, this just takes a couple moves longer here. And the clinical move here is actually queen to f7, threatening hg, and rook takes h5, which will be mate. So this is definitely worth remembering. What else is there to say? I guess black has bishop d6, but as long as we maintain contact with the f5 square, this move doesn't change anything. Queen to a5 is the computer move, which evades any further attacks on the queen. Black can play knight c6, but then we take c6. We're up 2 pawns, and the raging attack against the king continues. So this is really all you have to know. h4 followed by bishop takes b7. Now, someone was asking what happens if black doesn't take the knight. Yes, the best move for black here is the pathetic queen e7. And this does win the pawn back. You just drop your knight back. But if black takes, look at the development advantage that white has. I was going to say development advantage that white has developed. White's going to go knight c3 castles, put something on e1, such as a rook, and black's queen is going to get absolutely massacred. This is +3 according to the computer. You can analyze this further on your own. It's been tried by some good players, but black is just dead lost here. Dead lost. For example, let's say black plays knight c6. I would actually castle, right? I wouldn't rush with knight c3 because the black queen is a great asset for white. If you play rook e1, either you win the queen or you can deliver a devastating discover check against the queen. If the queen drops back, there's a bunch of cool moves. You can even play knight to e5. Chigorin actually fell for a trick like this the one time that he tried the Damiano, and you lose the queen. So wherever you look, there are sexy tactics, and this is really not worthy of analysis. But before we move to the game continuation, the hilarious story behind why the Damiano is named after Damiano has to do with Ruy Lopez. Not the opening, but the man himself. Ruy Lopez was a priest from Spain who lived in the 16th century. He wrote one of the first books on chess where he examined some openings, including the one that's named after him. But a little known fact is that Ruy Lopez was actually the first person I think he invented a couple of other openings. He definitely considered the Italian, but believed that bishop b5 was a better move. That's why we name it the Ruy Lopez. He might have been the originator also of like the Ponciani and a couple of other openings. So his manuscript was really groundbreaking for the time. The funny thing is that he had a feud with Damiano. I've talked about this on stream before. He had a flat out feud with Damiano, who lived before him, and published a manuscript before Ruy Lopez, which apparently Ruy Lopez was jealous about. So Ruy Lopez falsely attributed the move f6 to Damiano and basically called it the Damiano game, kind of as a troll, right? Sarcastically. And it has stuck ever since, right? So we think it's named after someone who advocated for this move, but Damiano was actually the first one to refute f6. He understood that f6 was bad. He gave the refutation in his book, and yet we still call it that. I have the actual evidence for that and the historical underpinnings of this in a book that I have, but if I would rifle through it right now, this YouTube video would take 2 hours, so I'll save that for another video. Okay, so on we go to the game continuation, knight c3, f5, d4. Okay, e takes d4, I think, makes things even worse because it helps us open the center. Black's position here is in dire straits. According to the engine, f takes e4 is the only way to stay alive, more or less. Knight takes e5 and knight f6. Here, black is... Oh, no, black is actually busted because of a really cool line. So apparently white is supposed to go here, which looks rather dumb because of d5. But black is so poorly developed that almost any sacrifices are going to be strong here. So, for example, knight takes d5 is the engine move, sacrificing a knight in order to pave the way for a check on h5. Now, what did I talk about during the game? Anytime there's a knight on one of these three squares, g6 is innocuous because of knight takes g6. And what's funny is that here you don't take the rook. You actually take the pawn. You take the pawn. If the king steps up to e7, you skewer the queen. So king d7 is forced, and bishop takes d5 leads to clearly a decisive attack. Now, this is Stockfish 11 that I'm using on chess.com. You should probably confirm this with a stronger engine, but it gives +4, and I don't see any reason to doubt its evaluation. White's threatening checkmate in 1. Let's say knight takes d4. Now the other bishop comes out. Bishop e... Oh, now a sexy move. Bishop e6 check is winning. Either black has to step into a discovery, or black has to step into a skewer, and the bishop is pinned, so black can't block the check. Here you can even gobble up the pawn first, and only now you can take the queen. Bishop e3 check. White's got 3 additional pawns, c5, b4, with a decisive attack on the king, which has been driven all the way to the queen side, which I always kind of like. Wow. That is a pretty juicy line. So where did that come from? Yeah, so f takes c4, knight f6 is more logical to me. Here, bishop c4 is incredibly strong. It threatens knight f7. So black's hand is essentially forced. Here, knight takes d5. And if knight takes e5, then of course we just recapture, and now the queen defends the knight. And here I would even play like a Russian schoolboy and take back with a queen, take back with a bishop. So these lines are pretty one-sided, but they're always very fun to look at because they really demonstrate the importance of developing your pieces and the disaster that waits for he who pushes his f-pawn too early. Now you might be listening to this and saying, well, wait a second. I learned that in the Ruy Lopez, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, there is a variation called the Schliemann, where black plays f5. You might have also learned from someone like Eric Rosen that f5 is a possible move even after white plays bishop c4, even in the Italian. And how do you marry that with what I just said? Is f5 a losing line? Is the Schliemann refuted? No, the Schliemann is not refuted. White is considered to be better in the Schliemann. Actually, the best move, ironically, is d3, which is the move that I criticized in the context of our game. But you have to remember that these things I say are very concretely tied into the position. The bishop on b5 is not ideally placed in the context of punishing black from playing f5 because it's not controlling the a2 g8 diagonal, which means black is going to have an easier time castling. And if you play d4 in this position, the placement of the white bishop gives black a very important tempo. So here, fe4, knight e5, knight e5, d5. This position could have occurred in our game with the difference that there was a knight on c3 and the bishop was still on f1. Who can tell me how black can exploit the very awkward placement of the bishop to win material and get out of the gates with an advantage? Actually, black is better in this line. c6. Yeah, black plays c6. Okay, you might say, doesn't that send the bishop to where it wants to go anyway? Well, no. If you look carefully, this pawn is undefended. The king is on e1. Queen a5 check is a fork. And even though white has a development advantage, black will connect the pawns with d5. And white is actually lost after d5, simply lost. Because this pawn chain is impregnable. And black is going to start getting his pieces out subsequently. And black will not have a hard time castling. Now you might say, okay, I get it. But what about it in the Italian? Is f5 possibly a move that black can get away with here? And the answer is yes and no. f5 is a borderline losing line. And I will have a YouTube video refuting it because I know it's a popular subject of some YouTube videos. The best move here is, in fact, to play d4, much like we did in the game. But after e takes d4, the chief difference is that if white plays knight takes d4, kind of like we did in the game, I don't know what the mainline theory is, but I think the black move here is knight f6. I'm pretty sure this is the recommended move. And there's a very important concrete detail. The placement of the bishop on c4 is actually a drawback in this case. Why? Because black has the move d5, hitting the bishop with tempo. And obviously the idea is to undermine the e4 pawn. So this is one of the lines which is often featured in overviews of this variation, ed5, bishop f5. White does not lose a piece because white recaptures. But in the ensuing endgame, black gets a huge initiative. And this is exactly what the kind of position that Gambit players want. White might still be slightly better, but clearly we've gone astray. Now compare this to the situation after knight c3, f5, d4. If black plays knight f6 here, which probably he should still have done, I actually think this might be black's best move, just sacrificing the pawn in order to get better development. The move d5, it doesn't come with tempo. It doesn't attack the bishop. So I actually think that white could ignore everything that's happening in the center and play a move like bishop b5 to pin the knight. And if black plays pawn takes pawn, yes, black wins the pawn back, but look at how crappy this endgame is for black. Now, black's king is the one that's lost castling rights, e4 is weak, and white can calmly castle kingside on the next move. I know this is a lot of theory, but I'm trying to give you the kind of foundation for the things that I say and to make you realize that really the importance of studying openings. This is going to be one of the key takeaways from this little analysis session, because you can really see that making general statements about what's good and what's not in the opening is possible to a degree. I mean, you know, that developing your pieces is good, pushing pawns from in the corners is bad, but even that isn't always true. One thing that's true with the bishop on c4 can be false with the bishop on b5 and vice versa. But you definitely should not push your f-pawn with black unless you're specifically aware that it's a legitimate opening and that you've studied the theory. So anyways, I think bishop b5 here is very strong. And if black trades on f5, then white gets the bishop pair as well as an extra pawn. But at least here, black is able to castle. At least here, black is able to bring his bishop out and to castle short, and the game continues. This e6 square, by the way, could be used as an outpost, potentially for white's rook. So I like rook e1 here. The engine gives about plus 1.5, which I think is a reasonable assessment. Anyways, I know that was a lot. I think that our opponent's move fe, this is obviously the decisive mistake. And after knight c6 and queen h5, the game basically ends. Again, how did I see that quickly? Well, I'm aware of this idea, queen h5, queen e5, from the Damiano. And of course, we're also aware that you can take on c6 whenever you want to, and that relinquishes black's control over the e5 square. So f takes c4 is the losing move, and knight takes c6 is the way to punish it. Notice that we didn't just automatically grab on e4. As a matter of fact, knight takes e4, believe it or not, is a losing move. Knight c3 takes e4 loses the game. Maybe this is what our opponent was hoping for. Who can tell me why knight takes e4 loses material? And you should see this in just a couple of seconds, because there's tension between one pair of knights. That means the white queen is tied down to the d4 knight, and the simple queen e7 wins a piece. because the standard response doesn't work anymore. You lose the knight. And if you play f3, you run into d5, and you lose the piece that way. You can try bishop g5, but black can play knight f6. And ultimately, you're going to lose the knight e4. So this shows you when you're facing an unorthodox opening, an opening that you think is unsound. The first step is to kind of generally try to tell yourself why you think is unsound. What exactly is its main drawback? In this case, by specifically identifying its drawback, which is that it A, weakens this diagonal, and B, after bishop c4 weakens this other diagonal, I was able to more efficiently zero in on the best way to refute this opening. First, we know that we want to open up the center, and then second, we know that queen h5, queen e5 is often the way to punish openings that involve an early f5 or f6. Okay, so once again, I think knight to f6 was black's only chance to stay in the game. Of course, knight takes d4 was probably also better than what our opponent did in the game. Maybe queen f6 here is an attempt to exchange queens. But of course, we wouldn't have agreed. We would have played e5, driving the pawn in, preventing black's knight from developing to f6. And this is just a hot mess. I mean, knight e5 hitting the pawn. And you can kind of dig around here on your own. I think this will teach you a lot about how to play against such openings, but I don't want to bog you down too much. Let's take a quick look at how the game proceeded. So knight c6, dc. I don't think it even matters which way black takes. The variations are very similar. There's just one critical tactical detail that I had to foresee when I was making this move. This is really, really cool. So who can tell me a sequence of moves that seems to win the game almost on the spot, a la Damiano? Like, this is the same sequence that we had in the Damiano, with one critical exception. The black pawn is now on c6 rather than b7. So what comes to mind here? Yeah, the best move is knight d5 check, which is ridiculous. But how do we get to knight d5 check? Well, first you should see queen e5 check. Again, folks, bishop g5 does not win the queen. If you're newer to chess, don't assume that every skewer wins mid-tier. You can block a check. Here, black blocks the check with knight f6. And white is still winning, I think, after knight e4. But queen e5, king f7, and bishop c4 is exactly how we proceed in the Damiano. King g6 gets checkmated. It's actually mate in 3 after queen takes e4. Okay? But black has the move d5. But hopefully you're able to see that the king and rook are on forkable squares, and white has the very straightforward knight takes d5. But here is the twist. If black plays cd, then bishop takes d5 just ends the game. It's actually not even about the rook so much that it is about the fact that white's king is checkmated. The engine gives mate in 9 here. That starts with queen g3 check. But clearly, wherever the king goes, it's going to get checkmated one way or the other. Worst comes to worst, you could just take the rook and be up a ton of material. But what's the problem here, right? Again, you can never assume in these sharp positions that your opponent has to recapture a piece. You have to look more concretely than that. And if you do, you'll find that black has this weird move, bishop e6, getting the bishop out, and somehow white's pieces in the center are kind of loose. You really don't want to be playing the move knight e3 because this gives black a breather, and black can use this breather to quickly get the kingside pieces out and complete the manual castle. So anytime you have a flaw like this in a sequence, you need to consider that same sequence with a different move order. This is an incredibly powerful tool. Switching the move order can eliminate various defensive resources, and that's why we come up with the immediate knight d5 check. Same exact theme, but it does not allow black to cover the check with d5. C takes d5 is forced. Now we deliver a check like this, a check like this, and of course, we don't have our bishop out, so we will have to satisfy ourselves with queen takes rook, but this is obviously completely winning. Don't take on e4 first because of queen e7 pinning the queens. Anytime your king is in the center and a queen is on the same file, you have to be very careful. Knight d5 is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, knight d5 check is the move. But hopefully the logic is understandable now that I traced it. We start with queen e5. We see that detail, bishop e6, and we switch up the move order, starting with knight d5. Okay, so yeah, BC was more resilient. Of course, here, it's a different situation because black's light squared bishop is open, but on the flip side, the light squares around black's king are even weaker, with the d7 pawn gone to c6. So again, if you look at the computer, there will be probably even 4 or 5 different ways to reach a decisive advantage. I think the path that we chose is simple and incredibly strong. It's the second move according to the engine. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the details here. It's very obvious that black is getting checkmated. Again, g6, queen e5 is just mate in 2. Oh, we don't even need to win the rook. Knight f6 does not defend against queen f7. And I'll let you figure out the rest. What else could black have done? I was expecting queen e8 originally. And here I was intending, well, I thought there were 2 good moves. The first I thought was bishop g5 check, knight f6, bishop takes f6, and then swing the queen over to c5, forcing the king onto the d file, and now you castle with check. I thought this was a decisive attack, but now that I look at it, maybe this is not as convincing. According to the engine, on queen e8, queen e5 check is best. King d7. Now you give another diagonal check. Okay, king drops back. Now you develop the bishop. Okay, and now whatever black does, you castle with check. And this is just absolutely... Oh, look at this line. Takes, and bang, using the pin on the bishop. And now in comes the second rook with mate to follow. Yeah, so many cool lines. When you've got this many pieces in the attack, you're always going to get, really nice tactical details. Simple, but very nice. So in this position, black has to step the other way. But here you still develop the bishop with check. And here you deliver another check, forcing the king to the d file. And according to the engine, you're supposed to take on f6 twice, attack the rook, castle queenside. And I can go on and on here, but I'll just show one more cool detail. After rook f8, white has a really beautiful sequence that wins an exchange. And of course, with the exchange, black's whole position crumbles. Who can spot this two-mover along the same theme that the combination we just saw occurred? Yeah, bishop e6 check, deflection, and queen takes rook using the pin on the bishop. So many of these lines all around. Yeah, so maybe queen e8 was more resilient. Bishop e6, we take, and the game is over. The engine gives around +5, which I think is a accurate assessment, and it keeps growing the more it looks at this position. Queen d5, I think, is as good of a defensive attempt as any, forcing us to deliver this check. And then I think bishop d2 is really the star of the show. Also winning would have been the simple castles kingside. But after h6, I wasn't actually all that convinced, and I didn't want to give black the opportunity to take this knight and sack the exchange and prolong the game. So bishop d2 is really the cherry on top. It's more important to involve the bishop than it is to involve the rook. And we note that the e8 square is defended by the queen. That's very, very important. Bishop d2 is a quiet but deadly move. Black cannot stop bishop c3. And once again, b3 is the flashier execution, but the inferior execution because of the check on b4. And the moment black sticks the bishop on c3, you've actually lost all of your advantage here with white. Also, you have to be very careful about the d1 square being undefended. So in any case, we play bishop d2 to preclude that possibility. Then we stick the bishop on c3. We give a check on e2. We go rook d1. And if you look at, again, if you flip on the computer, the best move is, in fact, bishop e5, which is what I pointed out. But this is where simple execution is just much more practical. Just take on h8, and you know for a fact that you can convert this position because black has no way of trapping the bishop. There's no pawn to put on f6. And, I appreciate that our opponent didn't prolong the torture and resign in this position. So only 18 moves. Conceptually, a very simple game, which illustrates the importance of blasting open the center when you have a big development advantage, when your opponent has a weak king. But hopefully you also found the sort of theoretical exposition to be helpful. I will be doing a video in the near future on this opening, which I think is called the Rousseau Gambit, and it is problematic for a lot of players, and there's quite a bit of theory here. I have some cool analysis in this opening. And the refutation starts with d4, e takes d4, and now actually the move e5, driving the pawn in and preventing the knight from developing. But there's a lot of stuff here to break down, so I'll be doing that pretty shortly. f5 against the Ruy Lopez is a totally legitimate line. I played it against Dominguez in the U.S. Championship in the last year, and I managed to make a draw. So you can definitely consider the Schliemann as a very interesting way to spice things up against the Ruy Lopez. But on that note, folks, I think we'll call it a day. It's really late. I'm going to go to sleep. I'll see you guys later. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks again.